Let you know about. We are beginning on the 14th of May. May is coming soon. A course called 321. If you are someone who is considering Christian faith and what it means, if you know someone who is Jesus curious, who's been asking questions, or someone who should be asking questions, then this is the course for them. It's only 4 weeks, and it is really very much an introduction for people who are exploring faith. It takes us through a bunch of kind of keynote questions, through videos and discussion. We'll also have some coffee and cake. If you want to find out a bit more about it, there's some links on the weekly update, and if you Google Speak Life, then you'll find information. So please bear that in mind. We'd love to have you with us for that. If you want more information, probably best to speak to myself. So that's the 14th of May. A couple of weeks' time, it will be at the point across the road at 7:30, and just keep looking out for that information and all the reminders. So this morning, we want to welcome our special guest, Suzanne Blythe, who has brought her husband, Stuart, as our preacher this morning. It's good to have Stuart and Suzanne with us. Stuart was, for many years, a Baptist pastor in Scotland, serving, I guess, primarily in Kirkintilloch. And then he served in theological education with the Baptist College here in Glasgow, the European Baptist in Amsterdam, and then at Acadia University in Nova Scotia. So pretty well-traveled kind of person. And Stuart just returned recently to Glasgow to become pastor at Old House Community Church. And it's just great to have him around. As many of you will know, we work alongside Old House to run Westminster Theological Centre, which is a really innovative training hub offering degree-level training to all sorts of people, whether they are looking to go into ministry, whether they are looking to be more resourced for their workplaces. In fact, we even had one of our students. We sang one of our songs this morning, so there you go. It's all being produced at WTC. So we love working with Stuart and with the guys at Old House. So perhaps you'd just like to welcome Stuart this morning amongst us.
Thank you. Grace and peace to you from God the Father and from our Lord Jesus Christ. God is with us, and His Spirit is here. I've met some people here today I haven't seen for 30 years. You just look the same. I would love to be able to say that. I can't. Our reading this morning is from Luke chapter 24. Thank you for the welcome and the introduction. Thanks, Ian. Luke chapter 24, I'm going to be reading from verse 13. I'm reading from the New International Version, and in the New International Version, this little section is entitled On the Road to Emmaus. You will know the story, I'm sure. It starts now that same day, that day being Resurrection Sunday. Now that same day. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus. He said to them, "How foolish you are, how slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he was going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Last Sunday, of course, was Easter Sunday, and in many a church, perhaps here also, the service would have begun with the words, "Christ is risen," and even a non-liturgical congregation could sometimes manage, "Christ is risen indeed." But 1 week later, Christ is still risen. And the question is, how and when or where might we experience him and see him? Our passage this morning is entitled "On the Road to Emmaus." People who know me know that I am interested in the titles that are given to different passages in the Bible. These titles, of course, don't originally belong in the Bible, but have been added by the different translators of the different versions. And they give us these titles to explain the parts to us. One, to break up the many words, and also just to help us kind of understand what is going on. And this can be good, and this can be really helpful, and it can also be really misleading. For these titles tend to frame the way in which we see the passage that follows, and that might be wrong. So, for example, we have a story in the Gospel of Luke, Luke 7:36 to 50. It's a story it's a story of a woman who comes, anoints Jesus' feet with perfume, and then washes and dries his feet with her tears and with her hair. And in the New International Version, this is called Jesus anointed by a sinful woman. Makes sense. Interestingly, when you read the passage, the people who emphasize her sinfulness are the Pharisees, not Jesus, who praises her much love. So why is it not called the woman who showed a lot of love? But already we have had an influence as to how we're going to read the passage. Or, a great one, love this one. In the Gospel of Luke, we have the well-known story of the Good Samaritan. It's called that. The parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus never calls the Samaritan good. Calls him compassionate. And if you want to argue, the good people in the story are actually the least in the priest and the Levite. The thing is about compassion rather than goodness. Now, I know some of you might want to fact check that. You're going, "No, it must say good in there somewhere." And you're going to look it up. Wait to the end of service to do that. It's okay to fact check some things. This morning I had to fact check whether the word pterodactyl starts with a P. And it does. So both what I'm saying about the Good Samaritan and about pterodactyl are true. And here we are on the road to Emmaus. Of course it makes sense because they are on the road to Emmaus. But the significant thing about this passage is not actually where they are going, but where they are coming from. This is not a story towards, this is a story away. This is a story of people going away. They're going the opposite direction from the sign that says city center this way. They are on their way away. They are on their way away from Jerusalem. They are on their way away from the other disciples. They are on their way away from their hopes of redemption. They are on their way away from the talk of resurrection. They are on their way, but they're on their way away. And they're on their way away because of the difference, the discord, the disassociation between their expectations and their experience. Because what they, and the key phrase in here, what they had hoped for hadn't come to pass. Jesus, the one known as a prophet who they had hoped was the Messiah who would bring redemption to Israel, has now been dead for 3 days. And therefore it seems that all that they had hoped for from him is not coming to pass. And at this point, talk of resurrection is kind of, well, they told us a story, but when we got there, no one saw him. These people are on their way away. Their mood is melancholic. A picture of that is, it's as though they are the crowd on a supporters bus after a final which they lost. And so, when Jesus asks them what they were discussing in verse 17, we are told they stood still, their faces downcast. People can often feel pretty downcast about their experience of Christianity and the church. Now I know, as some of you will know, that in the past few weeks, there's been good news for the church. There's been good news because Bible Society has carried out a survey, and it indicates an uptake of interest in attending church, in reading the Bible, in spiritual things, and people who are Jesus curious. It indicates an uptake of interest in these things, particularly from younger people. And this indeed is good news for the church. But of course, not being cynical, we need to be cautious as to what the research actually says, what it means, and what we do with it. Because there's nothing uglier than a triumphant church shouting, "Aren't we great? You should take us more seriously." History will show this is not a good way to do mission. More than that, this uptake has to be set against a rapid decline in the church that has been taking place since 1960. And therefore, we need to be happy, but we need to be careful, and we also need to be mindful and thoughtful that one of the reasons there's been a decline in the church is because people have gone away. In my previous jobs, I have learned a lot that retention is as important as recruitment when it comes to numbers. And over the years, people have been following the opposite direction from the sign that said, "City Centre this way." People have been moving away. Sometimes people have been moving away because of the things done to them intentionally or unintentionally by the church. Bad church experience. People are moving away. And some people are moving away because things have happened to them that the teaching of the church hasn't offered any satisfaction to. Who are these people? These people are our children. These people are our friends. These are people who we have baptized, who we have worshipped with, and who we've had and shared communion with. People who are on their way away. For many years, I've been part of a theological reading group. Sounds fancy, doesn't it? And when it was set up by a number of colleagues. And so it was given the very grand title when we were set up of collegiates. Very quickly, that was shortened to a much more affectionate Egypts. And in this reading group, I was famous for never reading the books, okay? In fact, I made it a thing after a while. But recently, and the group has been going for years and years, and it survived itself through a the pandemic, and we would join on Zoom. And although I was overseas for a number of years, I kept in contact with the people. But recently we read a book, and I read it because I'd been asked to choose it. It was a ploy on their part, I think, to make me actually read the book. And it was a book by a Canadian writer and blogger called Sarah Bessey. And in this particular book, she writes it for people who, as it were, have gone the opposite direction from the sign that says city centre this way. People who have moved, as it were, not to Emmaus, but to the wilderness. And as she writes for such people, she highlights many of the reasons that might take people on that journey. But in one chapter in the book, she compares their experience to the experience of the two disciples here, and says, when I speak to these people about their journey away, I hear them say time and time again, we had hoped. I paraphrase, we had hoped that our marriage could stand anything. We had hoped that if we brought our children up in a certain way, we would get a certain outcome. We had hoped that we could come to church with our whole selves and honestly. We had hoped that it would be a place where the marginalized were really welcomed. We had hoped that he'd lived long enough to see his grandchild. We had hoped. And while Sarah Bessey rightly says we need to critically examine our expectations, she also says the truth is for many of these people, their hopes were based upon the fact that they believed the gospel and Jesus Christ, and their experience somehow ended up different. We had hoped. Those on the road to Emmaus could be you or I. And maybe actually it is you and I inwardly, even though we're physically here. Or it could be people who we know. We had hoped. But we know, and it's great, that the story doesn't end there. Because before it's over, they hightail their way back up the road to Jerusalem. I love narratives. I love the way they work. And when you read this story, it takes them about 15 verses to get to Emmaus. It takes them half a verse to get back to Jerusalem. It's true. Read it. It's in the passage. You know, we get all that story that goes, well, they went back to Jerusalem. Move on. Thanks very much. We've just been on the road down for anyway. And I think that's meant to convey to us this sudden and this dramatic, this change in direction, this change in anticipation. They go back to Jerusalem, back to events still unfolding, back to the group, back to renewed hope, and back to the claim, he is actually risen. Jesus is risen. And the transformative moment in all of this is their experience of the risen Jesus Christ. They see him and they recognize him, and that takes them back to Jerusalem. They begin to head back in the direction of the sign that says city center, this way. And that moment for them, that moment of discovery, that moment of eyes being opened, we are told, is when he takes bread at the meal table and he breaks it, he gives thanks to God, he gives it to them, and they know him at the breaking of the bread. Verse 30, when he was at table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Because of that, people will often say this is a flashback in Luke, as you might get in a movie, or as you would get in another narrative. It's a flashback in Luke to the Last Supper. Although we're not sure those two were there. The actions of Jesus at the table are more like a flashback to the feeding of the 5,000. But if it was me, if I was making a movie at this point, I would have a whole pile of scenes up on the screen. The scenes that we would flash back to are Jesus sitting at table fellowship with outcasts and sinners, because for such of these he had come. I would have flashed back to his conflict at the meals with the Pharisees in their homes, of which there are at least 3. I would have flashed back to when he invites himself to Zacchaeus' house to show that even people like that could be changed. Yes, I would have a flashback to the feeding of the 5,000, and I have a flashback indeed to the Lord's Supper. But the whole point of this is that moment was a flashback to the whole of his life and who this now was sitting in front of them. Jesus is risen. Same Jesus is now risen and present among them. But here's the great thing. He was with them before they even saw him. He was with them as a stranger. He was with them, isn't this beautiful, on their way away. He was with them in their conversations, and of course, he was with them as he opened the scripture to him. And in hindsight, they looked back and they said, well, didn't our hearts burn within us when we discussed the scriptures on the way? Luke tells us that they hadn't recognized him because they'd been kept from recognizing him. It's a strange thing, that. Maybe it's simply necessary to teach us all that sometimes when we don't know it, Jesus is actually there in the stranger, on the journey, and in the conversations. And maybe we need to pray, open our eyes to see the risen Christ who's walking the world today. And all of the conversations about this quiet, I maybe said revolution, quiet revival that people are talking about. One of the things that I enjoyed so much, and I'm sure some of you may have read the story, although it was in The Guardian and that might not be your flavor. But there was an article in the Guardian newspaper last week. Wonderful, you'll get it online and you can, without paying, by Lamorna Ash. She's a freelance writer and journalist. She's 29 years of age, and she set out to explore whether she could become a Christian in a year. This took her on a journey of interviewing different people who had embraced Christianity, and it took her on a longer journey. And then at the end of the article in The Guardian, and this is in preparation for a book that's coming out, she tells this quite stunning story. It borders on beautiful. And she writes this: tell me before all of this started. That is her exploration of Christianity. And at this point, as part of that exploration, she joined a work party at Iona. And she writes this: tell me before all of this started that someday I would gladly attend 2 church services daily. And I'll say, you're mad. On Iona, I longed for our hours in the church like hunger. The words in the prayer book felt to me like escape valves. Every verse we spoke in chorus, it was as if some new guilt or hurt was released from my body. I found a language for faith that I could let in. A few days in, I was not sick anymore. My mood was even and content. On the last night in Iona, a pastor from Oregon asked me if I would read from the pulpit during the evening service. It was the first time I'd spoken in a church service. I rose with as much feeling as I could muster. This was the world now, and I wanted to be fully in it. As far as he might run, the psalmist declares, his God always remains close by him. As much as he cloaks himself in darkness, his God will see the light in him. On the altar of the darkness. Back in Oban, I went to a jewelry shop and bought a cross, cheap, silver-plated, thumbnailed size. As soon as it was mine, I wanted the cross on me, ripped open the brown paper, and struggling with the clasp right there, out in the cold, on a street overlooking a grey sea. The rest of the way home, I kept touching it there was so much I needed this cross to do. Christ is risen. Of course, we look and we hope to encounter him in the scriptures, of course. Of course, we look to encounter him in our worship, of course, and so we should. But maybe we need to pray for others and indeed for ourselves that God would open our eyes to see that Christ is risen and he is with us. Where is he? He is with us where we would have expected Jesus to be, because it's Jesus who is risen. Maybe we need to open our eyes to see him in the stranger, to see him on the journey, to see him indeed in the darkness. Sarah Bessie encourages people to develop what she calls, or to notice their own sacramental times. Where do you experience the presence and the love of God? And of course, it can be in the places we expect. But she says that she came to experience his presence less and less in the places she had been told to look, including Christian lady books. And more, she said, these days I feel God's nearness the most in the dark, in the public pool, around the table, on unremarkable sidewalks, during a daily walk, under a cover of stars. We shouldn't reject what she says, I don't think, or even resist, but ask God to open us up to the fullness of the awareness of his presence, because he is risen. He is risen indeed. And if we open our eyes, we might just see him. Amen.